First of all, Mazal Tov to all of you. It's such a wonderful occasion, and Tu B'Shvat Sameach. And I apologize if the lighting is a little bit problematic on my screen. I'll do the best I can. Masechet Megillah, as I'm sure you've experienced, is a wonderful Masechet. It's got lots of halacha, lots of agadah, and at the same time, without being too difficult, it actually has deals with wonderful, wonderful issues. So it's a totally wonderful. Just want to get into it so I can see you. It's a really special and wonderful Masechet. One thing Masechet Megillah is not, as you saw, and as Rabbanit Michelle was saying, is it's not really a Masechet about Purim. People expect it to be a Masechet about Purim, but it isn't. It's a Masechet about the Megillah, both as something that we read on Purim and as a holy object. And once it's a Masechet about something we read on Purim, it's also about reading Kriyat Torah and other holy readings. And it becomes a parallel Masechet to Brachot, about a lot of aspects of public prayer. And once it's a Masechet about what makes a valid Megillah, it becomes a Masechet also about what makes a valid Sefer Torah, and how you create and define holy objects. And one of the things that arises again and again is that not everything we might have expected to be holy is holy. We see it again and again. Some things are very holy, some things a little holy, and some things don't make it. And we witness a kind of tzimtzum. What should we use for the word tzimtzum? A sort of limitation of holiness in two ways, in terms of which things get called holy, which are assigned holiness, are considered to have holiness, and in a question of how we relate to these holy objects. So I want to bring some examples, and then I want to ask why this is so. Is there a little bit of a hesitation here with regard to the holiness of objects? I would like to suggest that there is, and to think together why. We've only got a quarter of an hour, so I can't open it up that much, though I really would be happy if somebody wants to suggest something that they interrupt. I'm sure your interruption will be as good as my idea, because we've all been sitting there with this Masechet. Now, I created a source sheet, which I hope is on the, put on the chat. Yes, it's on the chat, which is just in Hebrew, just with the original text. Sorry about that. If you want to refer to it, if you want to have it for another occasion, it's a source sheet with some points, mostly in Masechet Megillah, but also in other places where holy objects are related to. And we're not dealing with the Beit HaMikdash, right? The Masechet is really not Beit HaMikdash oriented, and the holiness here is not about the Beit HaMikdash. So where do we start? Well, we're going to start with the Megillah itself, right? The beginning of the second chapter of Masechet Megillah, chapter 2, the first two Mishnayot, start with defining how you read the Megillah. Not when, that was in the first chapter, but how. And what is a Megillah, right? So a Megillah is supposed to be written with a certain kind of ink. What can it be written on? Has to be written in Ashurit, which is the newer script of Hebrew, on a right kind of parchment with the right kind of ink, and it's got to be the right text, right? It's got to be in Hebrew, it's got to contain the entire story, etc. Actually, though, in Mishnah, the first Mishnah, there's an exception, which is that if you have a community of people who do not know Hebrew, in some country where they don't know Hebrew, in Russia in communist times, maybe in some parts of America, in their times in many communities, then what can you do? You can actually write a Megillah on parchment with the right ink and the right parchment and the right text in translation, and it can be a kosher Megillah. Can't do that with a Sefer Torah. As Rabbanit Michelle was saying, there's some differences. And for those of you who live near enough, you can find an actual fact. You can find such a Megillah if you go to the Bible Lands Museum downstairs. There is a Megillah in Judeo-Arabic, I think it is, on right kind of parchment, a perfectly kosher Megillah that it looks like was used actually for women, from what we can see, Megillah that was not in Hebrew. But except for the fact that in actual fact, in theory, there can be a Megillah in a translation, except for that, it's very, very specific how you get to write the exact objects. How do you create the object? Now, it's interesting, Megillah doesn't have Hashem's name, as you know. So you create this holy object without Hashem's name. And once we're talking about that, well, there's a Mishnah which talks about generally holy texts. And that's in the first chapter of Masechet Megillah, Mishnah Chet, the 8th Mishnah. Ein bein sfarim letfilim umuzuzot. What's the difference between tefillin and sfarim, i.e. holy books, whether it's the Chumash, let's say, whether it's a Sefer Torah? What's going to be the difference? Again, actually, theoretically, the suggestion there is that you could write Sifrei Kodesh. You may remember this from studying it in translation. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says only in Greek, and nowadays we don't know that Greek. A whole question of whether or not you can write a Sefer Torah in another language, what makes for this holy Sefer Torah, and in the end, the pinnacle of Kedusha is the Sefer Torah, and it must be in the original Hebrew. And then we have a quote which I brought from Masechet Shabbat, which talks about a big discussion, which gets quite strong about how we relate to all kinds of holy books, yes, whether it's the Chumash or later books, which are in translation, like the book of Job in translation. And is that a good thing or deeply problematic? Depends who translated it. Depends how good a translation it is. What was the attitude of the person who translated it? We're talking about the early period of Christianity. Are there other kinds of translations going on with different agendas? Translation becomes something very, very interesting, but very multifaceted. And we again have the question, how do we relate to a text which is a translation with maybe a very different agenda, right? So we get all these questions of holy texts. That's one kind of holy object. Then we get the beginning of what's the third parak in Mishnah, but in the Gemara is the beginning of the 4th chapter, which is the question of selling a shul, selling a street, selling the box that holds the Sefer Torah, the Aron, selling the Sefer Torah itself. What can you do? You always have to go upward in terms of Kedusha. So Kedusha, holiness, sanctity, isn't an all or nothing concept, right? You can go upward from one to the next, but never down. You can't sell a Sefer Torah in order to build a nice shul, right? You can move upward, but you can't move downward. And we get a wonderful argument, which could not be more relevant than today, about what we do about a street where people tend to daven. I don't know about most of you, but I've got a parking lot in front of my house, and there's still davening there every day, 3 times a day in this parking lot. Is it still a parking lot or is it a shul? Right? That's a machloket. It's a difference of opinion. How do we relate to it? What can I do there? Can I still comfortably park my car? What's going on? Did it completely change character because of this temporary prayer there, which got to be rather permanent? So what do we do about intermediary kind of spaces and objects and buildings? And where does Kedusha come in and out? Then we have another discussion. On that discussion in the Mishnah, on Daf Kaf Vav, page 26b, in case you've got a Gemara, I want to take a quick look. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, Tashmishei mitzvah nizrakim, tashmishei kedusha nignazin. Objects used to do a mitzvah get thrown out. It's true, I'm sure you learned it, that Judaism couldn't live with that. We couldn't live with that, so we moved it to, well, but don't throw it out in a way that's not respectful. But really, the original halacha is tashmishei mitzvah, an object you use for a mitzvah like a lulav. And when it's finished, it's finished. It's over. But tashmishei kedusha, not only the Sefer Torah itself, but the box you put the Sefer Torah in, the cloth you used around it, that stays holy. So tashmishei kedusha are very different from tashmishei mitzvah. It's kind of anti-intuitive. I would have thought my lulav would be have more holiness than the cover to a Sefer Torah, but no. The Sefer Torah has God's name in it. It has a text, which is, as Rabbanit Michelle said, there's a purity to it, an authenticity to it, and that has kedusha, and therefore the thing which we kept around it keeps a certain kedusha, as against an object which is something you just can throw out afterwards. It's you used it, but then its use is over in some kind of way. Then we move on to, so that's another limitation as to what has holiness. Objects that you use for mitzvahs don't have holiness. It's different. There's something different about it. Holiness is about something that somehow connects to God in a way that it lasts, in a kind of way that God's eternalness, which we don't have, eternity, which we don't have when it comes to objects we do mitzvahs with. And then we have our biggest surprise. So we have a limitation so far in terms of imperfect texts, translations which are not, which can be ambiguous, which can be different, which can be inexact, text written not exactly the right way. Then we have another limitation, another symptom in terms of objects that were for mitzvahs as against objects which contain the text, a holy text. And then we have the most surprising one, which is actually in Masechet Yadayim, in another Masechet altogether. I don't know if you came across this one yet, which is to do with the idea that the rabbis decided to assign impurity to holy objects. Imagine the idea. It sounds absurd. We think of impurity as some kind of taboo. It's out there. It's far away. This is very important, I think, for us as women, that impurity is not some kind of taboo. On the contrary. Why did they do that? Because the Sifrei Torah, it would seem the reason was that Sifrei Torah were being stored together with Truma, which was food, and along when there's food, what are there? Little mice, and the mice were nibbling at the Sifrei Torah. So what did they say? Okay, everybody, Sifrei Torah have a certain level of impurity. You can't store them together with the food. That's what happened. So the last thing we would have expected, they decided to put together two categories we would have never thought of putting together, which is impurity and the greatest sanctity, the greatest holiness, and said, that's it. When you touch a Sefer Torah, it creates a certain level of impurity for you, right? Really surprising. So how could they do that? How could they relate to this, as we were looking at, Rabbanit Michelle was just teaching about the laws of the Sefer Torah and be careful and not touching and all that, and suddenly they were quite happy to nevertheless assign impurity to it. And how could this be? So I want to make a few suggestions. The first suggestion I want to make is that from a practical point of view, we live in the world. And therefore, we can't have a situation that any impingement of Kedusha creates total Kedusha. We can't have it if we decide to daven once in the parking lot, or even for a few times, but in an impermanent way, it's no longer a parking lot. It is a parking lot. It's a parking lot we also prayed in. Some things are dynamically, that's a shul, and then it has its holiness, but some things are both, and they don't immediately, from a practical point of view, we can't end up with the whole world because it touched. And not only that, I think it's a lesson that things, everyday things, can also share in the world of Kedusha without becoming holy objects or holy places. That doesn't mean they can't share in potential for Kedusha. The potential for Kedusha is everywhere. It's not just in those objects. So every time there's a bit of praying somewhere, we don't say, oh, that's now only a holy place in comparison to others. So there's a kind of both practical and thoughtful kind of aspect to allowing for the fact that Kedusha, holy prayers can occur in a place without it immediately, that meaning of that place totally changing. That's one. The next thing I think has to do with authenticity. The problem of getting the text right, and not all texts are going to have holiness, that you need a sofer to write it, a scribe to write it with a certain intention, with a certain purity in his thoughts. To make a Sefer Torah, it's not that simple. There's all sorts of questions. What do we do about printed material? What is its level of holiness? To make a Sefer Torah has it's a goal, and it's not that easy to do. And again, when we get to translation, because of the ambiguity, because of the different visions of the translators, Jessica Sachs, who does a lot of translation of Sidurim, Tanakh, she talks magnificently about the ideas and the thought that have to go into any particular translation, how you think about it. And you can't, if you don't know who the translators and how much work was gone in, and you can never catch a poem completely into another language. It won't be quite the same. The ambiguity, the ambivalence that there is, both in law and in poetry, will never be complete. And so the pinnacle of holiness will only be in the original. That's not all holiness. There'll still be a certain level of sanctity, but the pinnacle will stay in the original text with the name of God. But I think there's another reason which actually runs counter to everything I've said so far. And that is that there's a problem with assigning holiness to objects. There's a problem with icons. There's a problem with objects becoming too important. We don't want the object to come in place of the act. We don't want the object to come instead of the relationship with God. We don't want the object to come instead of God. We don't want the object to become an icon. We want the object to remain something to be used towards a relationship with God, something that helps us create. The same way we want our learning to be something which creates a relationship. We want the reading of the Megillah, the act, to be the supreme, not the Megillah itself. For all the laws about it, it's going to be the reading from it that's going to matter more than how I keep it. It's important how I keep it as a part of it. But if I keep it in my closet and I never read it, if I have this great Gemara on the shelf, but I never touch it, I never open it, then it hasn't done what it needs to do. So there's a worry in overdoing holiness of objects. That the object shouldn't become the main point, but what's in it and what's in it for a relationship. And I think this we can see from another little line, a tiny line that gets ignored on Daf Kaf Vav Amud Bet on 26b, which was Amma Mazutra, Mitpachot Sfarim Shebalu, the coverings, the cloth coverings around Sifrei Torah that eventually wore out. What do we do with them? We can't throw them out. They're holy because they held holiness. So in theory, we have to lignoz, we have to put them in a geniza, we have to conceal them. But what should we do with them? What did they do with them? What's a good idea to do them? Use them to make tachrichin lemeit mitzvah. If a person dies and there's no one to care for them and bury them, it's called a meit mitzvah. It's a mitzvah on whoever gets there first to bury this person. It's a mitzvah on the community to bury this person. V'zohi gnizatan. What is the best way of gniza, of respectful hiding away, concealment, and keeping of this worn out Torah cover is to sew it up as clothes for a meit mitzvah, someone who was left, who didn't have someone to bury them, and to use it for that. In a sense, it comes full circle. The cloth for the Torah becomes the cloth for somebody who could try to keep Torah. Yes, and for the respect to that there's that the real holiness comes in the marriage between the Megillah and the reader, between the Torah and its reader. One without the other is empty. So Masechet Megillah really is about the fact that as on Purim, appearances aren't all of what it is. There's something inside that has to happen. There's something hidden that has to happen. And that's the magic between the text, the holiness, and our relationship, our experience of it, which creates our relationship with God. Thank you, Michelle, Rabbanit Michelle, for inviting me to join you. It's really a very exciting thing to do, and may you enjoy your learning tremendously.